Welcome to another episode of Policy Gone Viral. I'm Andrea O'Sullivan, Director of the Center for Technology and Innovation here at James Madison Institute, and today we have a very special guest, Adam Thierer. Adam is a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he studies technology policy. And until very recently, Adam and I were actually colleagues, and we've co-authored several studies and articles on emerging technology issues over the years. Adam literally wrote the book on permissionless innovation, which is a key component of our work here at the Center. And he's here today to talk about his new book, Evasion of Entrepreneurship, How Innovation Improves Economies and Governments, and how it relates to the current pandemic. It's great to have you, Adam.
It's great to see you again, Andrea.
Yeah. So you're probably best well known for promoting the concept of permissionless innovation, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that we shouldn't need permission to experiment with new and better ways of doing things, except in very, very small situations. Can you talk about evasive entrepreneurship, how it relates to permissionless innovation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, basically, evasive entrepreneurs are just innovators who put the idea of permissionless innovation into action by their actions in the marketplace and in society more generally. And after I finished the second edition of my permissionless innovation book, I was out on the road doing a lot of talks and writing a lot of papers with you and others. And I kept having people come up to me and just give me really interesting examples of what they thought to be permissionless innovation in the real world. And I just started taking notes and slowly but surely compiled a compendium of really interesting examples of things that people were bringing to my attention. And then I realized, I need to come up with a better way to describe these people and what they're doing. Permissionless innovators doesn't really quite get it exactly right. So in looking around for a different or better term, I realized that some of my colleagues at the George Mason Economics Department had really already come up with a pretty good one, which was evasive entrepreneurs. And Pete Bedke, Chris Coyne, Pete Leese, and some others, they had been using this term for many, many years to describe activity that they've seen in other markets, but mostly markets, say, in sub-Saharan Africa or Asian countries where people had to behave more evasively to get around some really misguided rules, regulations, and taxes. But evasive entrepreneurialism can happen even in Western countries and major capitalist countries that engage in normal types of commerce, but people eventually get fed up with rules that hold back their innovative activities, and they act to try to find a way to do a bit of an end run around the system or process if they feel it's just completely broken or at odds with common sense. And because there's been so much of that activity in recent years, I just decided to start documenting it and then also provide a defense of some of it. Because the most interesting thing about evasive entrepreneurialism is that it's very, very easy to defend permissionless innovation, evasive entrepreneurialism ex post, after the fact. A lot of people do it. But who defends it when it's happening? And that's really what's interesting, because there's a lot of interesting reasons why we might challenge the idea that people should evade rules and regulations. Obviously, we shouldn't break the law. And so my book gets into the ethics of permissionless innovation and evasive entrepreneurialism, which really goes well beyond what I was doing in just permissionless innovation.
Sure. And so for our viewers and listeners, can you give us one kind of really good example or case study of evasive entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, the paradigmatic example would probably be the sharing economy, and not just Uber and Lyft, although they're big players, but Airbnb and the many other folks that came in over the last decade and utilized new sorts of decentralized distributed technological capabilities to find ways to challenge the status quo. And I tell the story in the book and a lot of the writing that I've done here at Mercatus with you and others in the past about how for the better part of 70 years, we had a lot of consensus among economists, political scientists, lawyers, and even government officials at the federal level at least, that most taxi cab regulations, for example, were really crusty, archaic, cronyist hell that did not serve the public interest or consumer choice. And yet we never got any change. We never moved the needle on that at all. Instead, the status quo remained in effect for the longest time until through 2010, until Uber and then very quickly Lyft came along and many other ride-sharing competitors. And the whole world changed overnight because those ride-sharing competitors, they had new technological capabilities that they used to their advantage to essentially do a bit of an end run around the regulatory process. They were regulatory entrepreneurs, which is another type of term that relates to evasive entrepreneurs. they made policy change part of their business model. And it worked. They really did achieve a different type of leverage all of a sudden when they went in to negotiate with politicians, especially at the local level, to try to get a fairer shake for competition and choice. And so that's a really powerful example of evasive entrepreneurialism in action, I believe. And the sharing economy continues to be disrupted to this day. But the book goes through many, many other examples. You talk about food entrepreneurialism and all the interesting things people are doing to create new types of food or distribute food in different ways. Talk about drones and driverless cars and the interesting ways that people are pushing back against Federal Aviation Administration regulations or various types of rules and regulations governing automobiles. An area that you've written extensively on, Andrea, is blockchain, Bitcoin technologies, obviously massive permissionless innovation happening there, a lot of evasive entrepreneurialism. And I could go on and on and on. And in chapter 2 of my book, I provide a thorough inventory with a focus on 10 major sectors or technologies and just try to give people a feel for how extensive this activity or behavior is. And of course, I say, look, we don't, just because it's happening doesn't mean it'll always work or that it's always good. There are examples that I talk about, things like biohacking, where at once I'm very, very excited about things that are happening with regards to ways people are engaging in sort of citizen-based science with their own bodies or working with others to improve their lives. But there's also real dangers there. And we have to be honest about that and talk about a framework for how to deal with those risks, which is really the second half of my book, which is the first half is really an honest accounting of what's happening in terms of permissionless innovation and evasive entrepreneurialism, and then a defense of it. And then I get into the challenges and try to answer the critics to make sure that I'm not just some, wild-eyed Pollyanna-ish kind of character that says, it's all great, it's all sunshine and roses. No, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes things can go bad too. So we need to have constructive answers for those criticisms.
Sure, and that kind of speaks to the idea that it's in regulators and policymakers' best interest to understand these trends, to understand the potential fallout, right? If they're not proactive and if they're not carving out spaces of permissionless innovation where appropriate, innovators aren't going to stop. Sometimes it'll have a relatively good end, like something like the sharing economy, but it could also, spin out of control. So there's an element of good governance here as well, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I wanted to speak a little towards the current moment with the COVID crisis. And in some ways, I don't think your book could have been released at a better time. It's, kind of unfortunate, obviously, because of the horrible situation we're in, but it does give a lot of great examples of evasive entrepreneurship, and it's made it a real necessity just because some of the slowness to react on different levels, it's made private initiative all the more important. Have you witnessed this? Have you seen any striking examples of evasive entrepreneurship in the COVID crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question, Andrea. And ironically, just 2 weeks before my book was scheduled to go into print to the printers, I told the Cato Institute who published it, boy, it's a shame we don't have a chance to say something more about what's happening in the wake of the COVID outbreak and in the lockdown, because everywhere you turn, evasive entrepreneurialism is happening in response to the crisis. And they said, well, you know what? Write up something quick and we'll try to append it as a postscript to the book. And indeed, they got it in the version of the book that went out. So I'm very happy about that it includes a new postscript that basically describes the activities that we've seen unfolding in the wake of the outbreak. And it's sometimes small things like people making their own hand sanitizers or distilleries making it, or people making their own face masks or whatever else. But other times it's quite profound things. It's like doctors and hospitals putting out calls for people to help out with making better ventilators and maybe utilizing 3D printing technology and open source blueprints to come together to find a way to cobble together the solutions to a pressing public health crisis and a problem of a shortage of breathing apparatuses. And so that happened. And it was really quite amazing because at the time it was happening, I was like, there are FDA regulations that govern this. And how is this allowed? But people would either turn a blind eye to it or say, it's okay because there's a crisis. And that was really interesting to me, so much so that we started documenting here at Mercatus all the examples of rules and regulations that were being paused or completely sunsetted in the wake of the crisis. And you were helpful initially with starting that list with me, Andrea, and then later that blossomed to something much bigger, a project that we have here now at the Mercatus Center called the Fresh Start Initiative, which aims at addressing all the rules and regulations that have been paused or sunset during the crisis, and maybe finding a way to permanently reform or even sunset them. And what's interesting about this example, though, of all these rules, and let me be clear about how many we're talking about. Americans for Tax Reform has been trying to keep a tab on this. I think their tab is something like 600 plus rules and regulations
Right.
that have been paused or suspended. And that's really astonishing because those rules were put in place to serve the public good and in these cases serve public health and welfare. And yet at the very time we should have needed them most, lawmakers and regulators themselves said, no, we've got to get rid of them.
Right.
That's really interesting, right? It's not like, crazy libertarians say we have to get rid of the rules. No, these were lawmakers. These were regulators saying, hit the pause button, including the FDA and many other agencies. That should tell us something. It should tell us something, going back to the point you made before, Andrea, about like things are changing very fast. Technology moves very fast, sometimes exponentially, while policy moves incrementally. And sometimes something's got to give. The law needs to be changed or it needs to be relaxed in some way. So we should look upon this as a positive lesson going forward of how we can have more rational, commonsensical government if we're more flexible. But that requires humility. And this is a core point in my book and in all the work that we've done here in the past together is, regulatory humility. Trying to find a way to say, like, don't take the thou shall not approach always, the precautionary approach of saying, no, you can never do this without the right permissions. Like, how about some flexibility? How about some experiments? I'm such a big believer in the importance of trial and error experimentation and make that the goal of both my books is to get more of it in the form of permissionless innovation to see what happens. This crisis has given us the opportunity to live that experience in real time.
Right. And we need the experimentation, not just in the private sector, which, that is super important for growth and well-being, but really policymakers need to embrace that too. COVID has kind of forced that, right, in some way. And it makes you wonder, what other regulations might exist that COVID did not touch that are similarly perhaps they wouldn't pass a cost-benefit analysis, right?
Yep.
But we need regulators and lawmakers to really embrace that mindset for their own domains so that we can have the best of both worlds. And that leads nicely into my next question. So there is a silver lining to this, and there are positive policy changes that are coming out of the crisis. But there's the risk that once everything kind of goes back to normal, we'll get back into our old ways of doing things, and these laws that might not be necessary or in their current form, they might just come back, right? So what can policymakers who want to really embrace this kind of experimentation on the government level, what can they do to make sure that these policy improvements stick around? And the other side of this, because there are rules that are necessary, how can we make sure we're not just throwing everything away, but having an appropriate regulatory structure?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. It's the focus of the last couple of chapters of my book on Evasion Entrepreneurs. And really, I'll boil it down to two key recommendations that really play together quite nicely. One is called the innovators presumption. The other is called the sunsetting imperative. I'll start with the sunsetting imperative because it's very straightforward and it relates to the discussion we just had about what's been happening in the wake of the COVID outbreak, which is that there has been an attempt to do some spring cleaning by governments, to actually clean house of old archaic regulations that no longer made sense. And at minimum, they're pausing these rules. In other cases, they are formally sunsetting them. That's a wonderful thing. This is something that needs to happen regularly. We ask and expect people and other institutions to do those sort of spring cleanings and freshen up their house, every once in a while. It just makes good sense. But governments never do this. This is a fundamental problem and why we have so much regulatory accumulation in this country. And this is really affecting the quality of our government institutions and our government policies. So the sunsetting imperative basically says, look, at least with regards to technological activities and policies, let's have a rule put in place in every single new law we pass, and maybe hopefully for old ones that already exist, that say we need to be sunsetting these rules and regulations roughly at the same pace as Moore's Law. The idea that basically the power of a semiconductor doubles every 2 years or so. The price usually falls considerably, sometimes in half. We don't have to do it every 2 years. Maybe if even 5, I'd be happy. But why not ask for a sort of refresh of rules and regulations governing technology? Because of the fact that technology changes so fast, the so-called pacing problem, means that something that's in place, 10, 20 years down the road is not going to make any sense. It needs to be refreshed. So the sunsetting imperative needs to apply at federal, state, local level for all sorts of laws and regulations. And we need to have basically a big program or a thorough spring cleaning to start with, which is what we call the Fresh Start Initiative in Mercatus, to really get that process started. So that's recommendation number one. And states can do this and probably do it more effectively than at the federal level, especially with things like occupational licensing laws, certificate of need laws, and other permitting systems.
Yeah, Florida
The
actually
second
just did a
reform,
big overhaul of certificate of need laws. So there's still room to grow, but there's definitely appetite in this state for such reforms.
absolutely, and Florida's been a real leader, and many other states, Texas, Arizona, some others have taken some really good steps in this regard. So that's good news. The second thing is a little trickier, but I think is just as important, the innovator's presumption idea. The innovator's presumption is the idea that we need to be writing into law when we formulate new policy, and hopefully, again, it's retrospective and affects old laws. The idea that innovation is innocent until proven guilty. And all too often, we have the exact opposite presumption in public policy. We have the precautionary principles admonition that, we better to be safe than sorry. You should come and ask us for a blessing first to make sure everything's safe and dandy. And the problem with that is that forecloses all sorts of important types of experiments and trial and error. And as I pointed out in my earlier book on permissionless innovation, the fundamental problem with the precautionary principle is that if you make worst case scenarios the basis of public policy, it means many best case scenarios can never come about. And that it's only through that trial and error process that we get learning, growth, and prosperity. And so the innovator's presumption, as written, would basically stand for the proposition that the burden of proof shifts to the opponents of change to make the case that the new invention or entrepreneurial activity is so risky that we just can't allow it. We can't allow any experiments. As opposed to the opposite, which is today, like even the most trivial things, you've got to go and get a permission slip from somebody at some state capitol or at the federal level or some federal agency. And that needs to be reversed. We need to change that. And of course, there needs to be a serious debate about risk analysis and what we mean by technological harm in order to determine when and if we stop progress, we stop disruptive change. That is a legitimate debate. This is what I spend the last couple of chapters of my book debating and discussing. But the core point I make there, it's far too long to discuss here today, but the core point I make is that not everything can be an existential risk. The very root of the term existential is existence. Not every technological form of technological change threatens our existence. So we need to get serious about what we mean by technological harm. And it has to mean something more than just sort of ephemeral, like passing kind of things like, ooh, I'm uneasy about this, it's creepy. No, I'm sorry. These are not legitimate reasons to stop technology or technological change. Now, if it's got potential world-ending capabilities like autonomous killer robots do, absolutely. We should have that discussion. You know what? I think I'll sign off on some preemptive restraints on killer robots. And we might even find good reason to have it for other types of technologies like facial recognition technologies, which can have very profound ramifications for society. So let's have that discussion about technological harm, but let's do it with the presumption that most technological change is beneficial and is the key to driving improvements in human welfare. And then we will get the balance right going forward.
I think that's exactly right. And especially, talking about COVID, it's easy in good times to say, oh, it's better safe than sorry. But we've seen tragically that a lot of these regulations have not made us safe and they've also made us sorry. So it's
Right.
really difficult to kind of predict these things, and environments of permissionless innovation, even if limited to something like a sandbox. So the state of Florida is currently considering a fintech sandbox, which I'm personally thrilled about as somebody who studies cryptocurrency. And that kind of gives policymakers a better idea of the risk. When you're sitting here in a chamber and it's abstractions and it might be, emotional, think about the children kinds of what ifs. It's hard to know that risk calculation, but when you have an environment for experimentation, they can get a better idea of the true calculation there. And that's, I agree, so important. So we're getting towards the end of our time. I guess one concept I wanted to pick your brain about. So speaking of the spring cleaning, regulatory refresh, one thing you've talked about is regulatory review commissions, right? Kind of like the idea of the base realignment and closure on the federal level. The political problem is very acute, right? So there are some policy decisions that would clearly benefit a population, but you might have some special interest or people whose employment is tied to a current arrangement that make it very difficult to reform. And no politician wants to stick their neck and be the bad guy and be the one who's punished in the election by this interest group. So you have a very interesting idea for a way that we can get around that on the rules level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So you got it exactly right, Andrea. Basically, there are so many special interests and so many politicians who have various reasons for defending the status quo in terms of specific programs, rules, or regulations or taxes, that it's really, really hard to get positive reforms, commonsensical reforms put into place, because so long as they exist to defend them, they will throw out every barrier you can imagine to changing the policies. This is why we haven't had any major deregulations or agency abolitions in this country in 30, 40 years. It just doesn't happen. There's too many special interests. So we need to change that. We need to find the right kind of institutional design mechanism. And the best model that we can find in recent memory was probably the Base Realignment and Closure Commission model, which dealt with the problem of too many military bases in America in congressional districts in the post-Cold War period. After the Cold War was over, we were like, what do we have all these bases for? This is just a pork barrel scheme. But no lawmaker was ever going to vote against their own base in their own district. And so if it was every vote, was one base at a time, it was just going to fail. And so they came up with a really great design mechanism. Basically said, you know what, let's have a commission, an independent commission, study all of these bases, figure out which ones make sense, which ones don't. And then let's have a thumbs up or thumbs down vote on the entire package of recommended reforms. Like all these bases go, these few stay. That's exactly what we did. And it worked marvelously because the lawmakers that voted for it could vote for the entirety of the package without saying, like, oh my gosh, well, it was my fault for this. They could go back home to their people and say, like, look, it was an up or down vote on all of these things. And so I'm sorry, I would have never voted against our own district, but it was part of a reform of like a couple of hundred bases we're closing. That's what we need for other rules and regulations. We need a BRAC commission, but for bad rules that did not serve their intended purpose, that undermine the public interest or public welfare. And so this idea that we have at Mercatus of the Fresh Start Initiative, which could be applied again at the state level and probably just as effectively, if not more than at the federal, would basically put into place expert commissions or bodies or efforts to basically pursue those kind of up or down reforms of a package of rules. Like let's take a huge package of occupational licensing regs or certificate of need laws or put them all together with other permitting systems and figure out if we can maybe sunset a bunch at once that didn't make any sense. Let's be clear, this isn't about anarchy. This is about getting rid of all rules. There's going to be a lot of rules and programs that stay. It's about good governance. It's about keeping government in line with common sense and the consent of the governed. And we just don't do that in this country. We suffer instead from sort of what people call as demosclerosis, a chronic inability of governments to adapt to the times and to technological change. We need to change that. What I argue in my book, it's one of the reasons I so vociferously defend evasive entrepreneurialism, is that it is precisely permissionless innovation and innovative activities in the form of evasive entrepreneurialism that are moving this needle, that are getting this change to happen. When somebody like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb do what they did, we had a different conversation about taxi cab and hoteling regulations and taxes. But it didn't mean they all went away. We still have hotel regulations and taxes. We still have taxi cab regulations and taxes. It just means we got a fair shake for innovation. And that's what we need to do with something like a Fresh Start Initiative or a BRAC Commission for Bad Rules. I know Florida's interested in this, and Texas and Arizona. Montana, the governor of Montana, Brad Litted, just recently did an executive order on Monday that basically set forth this idea that this is what he wants his agencies to do, is something like this Fresh Start kind of effort. Like, take a look at all your rules, tell us which ones can go, and we'll vote on them. That's the way we need to move the ball forward on this. And that will open up the door to a heck of a lot more innovation opportunities if we do.
Yep. And state regulators have a handy tool in the Mercatus Center's State Reg Data Project, which actually quantifies the code, right, based on the number of words like shall or must, these words that confer an obligation. So they can look at, the first step, right, is looking at the problem, quantifying it. So that's one, Mercatus has done some great legwork on that. So great. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. It was very illuminating, and it certainly speaks to, trends in regulation and the current COVID crisis, and I think our listeners will find it very invaluable. So before we go, first I want to ask, how can our listeners and viewers buy your book, and where can they find your work and social media accounts?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for having me today, Andrea. It's been a real pleasure. And I miss you a lot. I really miss writing, all the great writing we did together. It was a lot of fun.
Likewise.
I would be happy if people would come follow me on Twitter. I'm at Adam Thierer, or other social media sites of their choosing. You can find the book at the Cato Institute bookstore, or you can go on Amazon or other booksellers and find it for sale on Amazon. You can, of course, also find the Kindle edition of it. You can also find the first chapter free to download right now on the Mercatus website. So you can find anything and more about the book and my previous book on permissionless innovation at those sites.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time and the conversation, and we will check in with you soon.
Thank you.
Right.
They gave us Mercatus branded face masks.
Oh, wow. Swag.
Yeah.